Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I am Nguyen, Brown Class of 2014, and the current president of the Asian American Alumni Alliance, aka A4. Before I go on, I also want to thank Eldridge Gilbert, Class of 2005, and the president of the Inman Page Black Alumni Council, aka IPC, for inviting us to collaborate with IPC and the Center for Study of Slavery and Justice for this event. The title of tonight's event is White Supremacy, State Violence, and the Anti-Trafficking Industrial Complex. The genesis for this came about as IPC and A4 were brainstorming a co-hosted event that would speak to and promote discussion and interaction between the Black and Asian communities. As you might know, within the past 2 years, especially with the backdrop of COVID-19, there has been increasing attention within the US on anti-Asian violence and racism, as exemplified by the Atlanta shooting, whose victims were mainly Asian. As a result, many members of the Asian American communities are also becoming increasingly aware of how their racial identity impacts how Asian Americans have experienced life in the US for centuries. And I believe, as importantly, many of them are also growing aware of the issues of race, racism, and discrimination that occur beyond the Asian American communities and within the broader society, and especially as this pertains to people of color and Black Americans. In the face of anti-Blackness, violence, and racism, as exemplified by incidences of police brutalities, such as those of Trayvon Martin and George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor's, the Black Lives Matter movement have become increasingly visible and globalized, demanding for the end of anti-Blackness racism and for a just and fair society for Black people everywhere. The Black Lives Matter movement, Black Lives Matter's movement built upon and is another continuation of centuries of Black liberation and anti-racism activism, which have also benefited many other marginalized communities, including Asian Americans. As A4 and IPC talk about such topics during our initial meetings, we realized that we were at a unique position to be able to explore in depth the connection between these two communities and our experiences and how they intertwine and impact each other, because we could easily connect with the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. The Center, or CSSJ, was founded in 2012 at Brown in order to bring together scholars, artists, and creative practitioners to examine the contemporary impact of the history of racial slavery. Its mission is twofold: to be both a scholarly research center and to support the public humanities, in order to inform the world that slavery isn't merely an academic and historic subject, but has huge reverberation and echoes throughout the world today. In fact, with its twofold mission, the CSSJ is the only such institution of its kind in the American Academy. The center staff, and importantly, its endowment, have allowed it to carry out its important work. The center helped us, A4 and IPC, to plan this event and topic, to discuss the Anti-Trafficking Industrial Complex as a lens to understand all communities' experiences, and importantly, to consider the possibilities for movement building and racial solidarity. I am grateful for the center's support and to especially thank Professor Anthony Bogues and Professor Elena Shih to guide us through this discussion. And I thank you for being here with us this evening for this event. With all that being said, I'd like to pass the mic along to Eldridge Gilbert, President of IPC.
Thank you so much, Nguyen, and thank you for your partnership and making this collaboration, this first collaboration between IPC, A4, and CSSJ possible. I have the huge honor of introducing Professor Tony Bogues to you all this evening. Professor Bogues has played a huge role, an influential role in my time at Brown as an Africana Studies major, as I'm sure many, many other folks can attest. And I'm thrilled of the opportunity that we have to support the CSSJ and Professor Bogues in his leadership as a leader of IPC, but also working in partnership with our Asian brothers and sisters at A4. Our collective support of CSSJ is crucial in that it allows the Center for the Study of slavery and justice to continue making a national and global impact on society and its understanding of the ripples of slavery that deeply impact our world today. So with that, a few quick words about Professor Bogues. He is a writer, a scholar, and a curator. He's published 8 books in the field of Black radical political thought, Caribbean intellectual history, and Caribbean art. He's currently working on a book called Black Critique and a project on the political thought of Michael Manley and Jamaica in the 1970s. He's also co-editing some of the unpublished writings of Sylvia Wynter and editing a volume on Haitian art. He's an Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory at Brown and the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and a visiting professor and curator at the University of Johannesburg. He's curated art shows in the Caribbean, South Africa, and the United States, and he is one of our leading leaders and thought leaders around this work, both at Brown and throughout the nation. So thank you so much, Professor Bogues. I'll hand the mic over to you to take us deeper into the topic tonight.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I just want to say, begin by saying a warm welcome to all the persons in this meeting, as well as a very warm welcome to all the panelists, and to thank the organizers most deeply for putting this event together. Let me say briefly why the CSSJ finds this topic so crucial. We find it crucial because there is a tendency in thinking about human trafficking today in the United States and elsewhere, of thinking about it in many ways, but 2 I think are important. Firstly, that people think about human trafficking as a kind of separate, discrete instance of injustice, a kind of stain which we have to wash away very quickly. Secondly, that's one way of thinking about it. Secondly, another popular way is to say this is the slavery of our times. Both these ways of thinking about human trafficking as a kind of discrete injustice that we have to wipe the stain away, or that it is just a slavery of our times, both these views, I would want to suggest to you, decontextualize human trafficking. One gives it no history at all, so it's just a stain you have to wipe away. And the other reduces it to another history, which then elides both historical specificities as well as contemporary features. At the CSSJ, the Human Trafficking Cluster, with the outstanding leadership from Professor Elena Shih, has attempted to reframe how we might think about human trafficking today. What are its historical roots? How do we connect the dots of race, of racial slavery, of secular colonialism, of empire? How do we connect those dots, not just to America, but also to the way in which human trafficking works and operates in the world? For us at the CSSJ, this is central sorry, to the work we do. Why? Because one of the things that we do at the CSSJ is that we think about the present, but we always think about the present in relationship to the past. We think about both past and present simultaneously. What is the relationship between past historical injustices and catastrophes to the ways in which societies are structured presently? And also, as well, we do this because for us, the business of thinking about the present through the past, of thinking through historical injustices and historical wrongs, means what kind of solidarities can we construct today amongst various groups of people who have been made to suffer the historical injustices of the past and which continue in the present. And so that for us, the question is both one of trying to think about past and present, but also trying to think about concretely, as we discuss past and present, what kind of solidarities do we need to construct? What are the obstacles to those solidarities? And how can we work together to construct construct a frame in which we can think about solidarities, because we need those solidarities to begin to think about how can we change this society, and indeed how can we make some difference in the world. Because so we don't just study the past and the present, but we think about the past and the present as one way of thinking about how to change. And if we do that, then the questions of solidarities are important, not just as a kind of pragmatic throwaway, but also as something that is very essential to what it is that we need to do in this world today. The research cluster's work has been led by Professor Shih. And she is, in my view, has done an outstanding job. It is one of the most vibrant research clusters we have. It is something that I think as we in the CSSJ are very proud of, but we are proud of it because of the kind of leadership that she has given. So let me just formally introduce her. Professor Elena Shih is the Manning Assistant Professor of American Studies at Brown University. She's the chairperson of the Research Cluster on Human Trafficking at the CSSJ, and therefore a faculty fellow. Her work, our current book project, Manufacturing Freedom, Trafficking, Rescue, Rehabilitation, and the Slave Free God, I think is well on its way, and hopefully will come out soon. But the center, our presence is invaluable. Her work with undergraduate students has been remarkable. And the ways in which she has directed research projects which engage communities is just simply outstanding. With a certain kind of passion and intelligence that she has, we at the center are really very proud to have her. And with that, I'll pass the mic over to her. Elena.
Thank you so much, Tony, for the kind, generous introduction, and to CSSJ staff, IPC and A4, and Alumni Relations and Media Services for putting this event together today. Thanks to all the alum who are joining us this evening. I want to update everybody and let you know that the university doesn't actually have a formal land acknowledgement right now. They're still working in concert with local communities to develop one, but in the Department of American Studies, we do have one, and I'd love to read it because I think it really speaks to the heart of the CSSJ's mission. We acknowledge that Brown University sits on occupied Indigenous lands, specifically the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. We note too that we stand on a campus that drew its early life's blood from the African slave trade in the Americas, that there are buildings here constructed by enslaved people. These acknowledgements commit us to a lifetime of unsettling anti-racist work. It's been such an incredible institutional home to be at the CSSJ, which I think is fully committed to these kinds of unsettlings through different projects and priorities and remembering, organizing, teaching, and curating. And really today, thanks to IPC, A4, and the alum who are here because of your interest in these topics. When we began planning this talk back in December or January, Andrea L. and Nguyen shared that alum had an interest, possibly in a panel on human trafficking. And we really wanted to share how we see this very, very broad topic of trafficking through the CSSJ lens. So our work looks particularly at the systems of racialized policing and global capitalism that frame anti-trafficking concerns. So our research looks at everything from centering the voices of Myanmar garment workers who produce fast fashion for the global supply chain of clothing, to understanding sex workers' rights and sex trafficking in places ranging from Ghana to Thailand to the United States. In 2017, we held a conference on campus provocatively titled Whitewashing Abolition, to really try to understand how human trafficking and the anti-trafficking movement casts an extraordinarily large shadow and often erases power at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and nation. We hope you all look out for a book that will be published from the proceeds of that conference called The Racism and Coloniality of Anti-Trafficking, co-edited by myself and Kamala Kempadu, to be published by Routledge next year. Two of our speakers from that conference are guests with us today, and their insights are always so powerful that we really knew we had to invite them back to share them with you today. Sarath Suong might be familiar to our alum, many of you who may have been Sarath's classmates in ethnic studies in the early 2000s. I think Elle mentioned that they did TWTP together. After Brown, Sarath went on to co-found the Providence Youth Student Movement, an incredible organization that organizes queer and trans Southeast Asian youth in Providence. And now Sarath is the national coordinator of the Southeast Asian Freedom Network. Also joining us from that 2017 conference is Lyndsey Beutin, an assistant professor of communications at McMaster University. Lyndsey's book project, well underway, published by Duke University, is titled Trafficking in Anti-Blackness. And this book explores how anti-trafficking campaigns against human trafficking reproduce anti-Blackness in the name of ending, quote unquote, modern day slavery. Another central project of our human trafficking research cluster is a large project on understanding the policing of sex work in Rhode Island. TWTV forever. In the past 5 years, we've had dozens of students join this project in different capacities. They've served as researchers, worked alongside community-based organizations, conducted street outreach with local sex workers. And at the CSSJ, we were so proud that some of these students were recently invited to offer their expert testimony at the Rhode Island State House at a House Judiciary Committee meeting that considered the decriminalization of sex work in Rhode Island. And this is an historic bill that the CSSJ worked closely on with the local sex worker rights organization. Fighting against the policing of Asian massage work, and particularly within this project, has always been a central part of our work, because we have been outraged at how fears of human trafficking have been used in Rhode Island and across the country to justify the raids, rescue, and policing of Asian massage workers. This work became thrust into the national conversation in March following the shooting at 3 Asian massage businesses in Atlanta that Nguyen has already mentioned. And in the aftermath of that shooting, 2 of our other guests really offered such grounding analysis that we felt it was vital for them to be a part of this conversation. Yves Tong Nguyen is a queer disabled Viet organizer with organizing homes in Survived and Punished, and Red Canary Suong, a grassroots coalition of migrant workers, sex workers, and allies working in Flushing, Queens. Unfortunately, Yves is stuck in the subway right now and can only text us, but we're hoping that they will get out in time for them to speak. If not, I organize with them and I'll fill in and I'll reach you when they text. Then finally, Melissa Brown is a postdoctoral fellow at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University and an incoming assistant professor of communications in social media at Santa Clara University. Her research centers the use of digital technology among Black women and LGBTQ people in relation to activism, sex work, and digital culture. Hailing from Georgia, where much of her research was also based, Melissa's insight into the racial legacies of present-day inequalities, including the policing of sexuality, were so helpful to contextualize the Atlanta spa shooting. So it's an honor to welcome all of you today. To promote discussion and Q&A, we've asked each panelist to speak just for 5 minutes and to encourage all of you to insert questions into the chat. You can direct them to me. I believe that my name is top at the chat right now because we put 1 in front of it. But first we'll turn everything over to Lyndsey. Lyndsey, your work has been so pivotal to helping us understand how anti-trafficking is oftentimes rooted in anti-Blackness. Would you please share some examples of how our audience might identify this when they see it in the wild?
Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you everyone for having this, for having this great panel. It's always an honor to be a part of CSSJ. So I'm going to share a few slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk today a bit about my academic research, which thinks about how anti-Blackness operates in campaigns to end human trafficking. So I'm particularly interested in how anti-trafficking advocates use the term modern day slavery and use it in ways that circumvent Western historical responsibility for slavery, and in ways that, I'm trying to parse, ultimately uphold structural white supremacy. So this is campaigns that are trying to end human trafficking. It sounds like a good thing, but in reality end up reproducing kind of anti-Black and anti-immigrant sentiment in policy. And they do so by suggesting that slavery still exists in Africa, thus making the contemporary legacies of America's past of enslavement kind of minimized, right, in favor of these anti-trafficking interventions that are often wrapped up in policing and global capitalism, as Elena was saying. So in the summer of 2020, uprisings for Black freedom inspired many unlikely corporations and organizations to issue statements in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. Organizations working to end human trafficking and sex trafficking connected their mission of ending what they call modern day slavery to calls to end anti-Black racism and police brutality. These statements were paradoxical, though, for several reasons. The anti-trafficking industry tends to support policing and carceral solutions to structural violence, which is in direct opposition to the Movement for Black Lives policy platform. And the anti-trafficking industry has a well-documented history of reproducing racial stereotypes, racist imagery, and white savior dynamics. So today I want to talk about just one example of how anti-trafficking reproduces racist narratives about Africa specifically and about Black mothers more generally. So an example that pops up in a lot of anti-trafficking media images and representation is the notion that Africans enslave themselves and their own kids. So within some of the most paradigmatic cases of anti-trafficking discourse, African and African diasporic subjects are depicted as capable of and willing to enslave other Africans, even their own kin. So we see this in depictions of Ghanaian child fishing, we see it in depictions of Congolese mining, in Haitian Restavik, as well as in the experiences of West African migrants traveling through Libya. So the narrative that Africans have always and continue to enslave their own kin when left to their own devices and must be intervened upon by more civilized outside forces also happens to be a long-standing anti-Black rhetorical tradition. Discourses about self-enslaving Africa were used to justify European enslavement of Africans in the 17th century. Post-emancipation, the rhetorical crutch of the slave trade within Africa was used to justify European colonization of Africa. And it repeatedly comes up to delegitimize Black demands for reparations for slavery in the present. So in September of 2016, The Guardian's Modern Day Slavery in Focus news platform, which is focused on human trafficking exclusively, published a photo essay about child labor and exploitation in Ghanaian fishing villages. The headline quoted a Ghanaian mother who was one of the subjects of the article. It read, "My kids hate me, I sold them. Slavery and child labor in Ghana," in pictures. The representation suggests to the viewer that these children are enslaved because of outdated or uncivilized rural African practices. The families, and notably in this case, the Black mother, is demonized as the sole cruel culprit of the problem. Such a depiction uses purported evidence of African self-enslavement to once again pathologize Black families, and Black matriarchy in particular, as unfit for modernity, as quite literally the progenitors of the problem of so-called modern-day slavery. So this kind of rhetorical depiction follows in a long, long history of blaming Black mothers instead of naming unfair and racist structural conditions, which ends up turning the history of systematic Black dispossession into a naturalized cultural pathology. So moving back to the BLM solidarity statements, we may be tempted to think that in light of this, these number of solidarity statements from anti-trafficking organizations, that maybe those organizations have changed their ways and altered the imagery and narratives they use about Africa and about Black mothers specifically. But unfortunately, that has not happened. So just a week after a major anti-trafficking organization issued its BLM solidarity statement, they released another statement in commemoration of the World Day Against Child Labor. And this statement begins, quote, "Many are forced to work by their families or by traffickers. Many are beaten." The letter proceeds to tell the story of a Ghanaian child working in the fishing industry. The story ends with anti-trafficking's vision of what freedom will be. Quote, "Kofi was rescued by the police. His stepfather was arrested and sentenced to pay a heavy fine or serve time in jail," end quote. So here, putting parents in jail is what frees children from so-called modern day slavery. Putting parents in jail is, for anti-trafficking advocates, what constitutes modern abolition. So despite BLM's robust anti-policing and even prison abolition platform, here anti-trafficking advocates say they're in solidarity with BLM while peddling these anti-Black historical narratives, such as Black parents being willing and able to sell their own children, and suggesting that policing in jails are paths to Black freedom, are paths to ending slavery today. So I offer this one example, just so when you see anti-trafficking media images, you can ask yourself, does this image suggest a narrative that Africans enslave themselves? Does it suggest a narrative that Black mothers are bad or that Black mothers are the problem? Does it suggest a narrative that slavery still exists in Africa? If it does, it might not be in support of Black liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndsey. It is always with a lot of almost hesitation that we house the Human Trafficking Research Cluster within the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice for these particular possibilities, dangerous possibilities of erasure that the modern day slavery framework has caused. And so your work is so helpful in that regard. Next, we'll turn it over to Melissa Brown. Melissa, your work is incredible and seeks to understand how Black women exotic dancers based in the urban South use social networking smartphone apps for advertising and networking. And your insights into how the landscape of contemporary strip club industry maps onto 20th century Jim Crow segregation is so central to this conversation on race, policing, and trafficking. I was wondering if you would just share some of your thoughts with us.
Sure. So as you just mentioned, the title of my dissertation is called The Jezebel Speaks, Black Women's Erotic Labor in the Digital Age. And the project sought to address three broad research questions. So first, with respect to embodiment and labor, in what ways, if any, do controlling images of Black women's sexuality emerge online? Second, how do power dynamics within the matrix of domination shape racial sexual hierarchies of worthiness and desirability online? And then finally, what sexual politics, if any, do Black women exotic dancers use on social networking sites to negotiate controlling images? And the reason why I chose to focus on Black women exotic dancers is because the majority of scholarships on sex work in the United States focuses on white women as laborers and white men as consumers. And the few studies that do exist about Black women sex workers reveal that they have distinct experiences and perspectives in and on sex work relative to white women and as well as non-Black women of color. The scholarship in sociology specifically addresses how sex work and the internet tend to focus on what's called the affordances of digital technology. So the ways that the features of a technology enable or constrain certain human actions or agency. So for example, a lot of scholarship indicates that technology facilitates better wages or more desirable clients for certain types of sex workers. However, one critique is that this literature tends to describe technology as a liberatory tool for sex workers, and it ignores the ways that the constraints of digital technology include the ways that certain exotic dancers or sex workers are racialized. But the majority of these studies also don't really address how these sex workers take up digital technology to negotiate the ways that they're racialized. So in my study, what I did is a digital ethnography of Black women exotic dancers that use the social networking application Instagram. And I specifically chose exotic dancers based in the urban South. One reason being that studies of Black women sex workers didn't center on the urban South. And secondly, because if we think about the legacy of sexual slavery in the United States, it does begin not only with Indigenous women, but also with Black women enslaved in the colonial South. So my project builds on several different literatures. So first it builds on Black cyberfeminism, which is coined by Kushana Gray. And it's this idea of studying the ways that Black women and LGBTQ use the internet in order to understand the ways that intersectionality and the matrix of domination create inequalities in virtual spaces, as well as relative to technology use and access. Second, I examined the ways that Black women and sex workers have different access to what is called erotic capital, specifically racialized erotic capital as theorized by Siobhan Brooks. And I also studied controlling images, which is coined by Patricia Collins, and this concept of specifically the Jezebel as Black women as hypersexual and sexually deviant, and the ways that these discourses emerge on internet-based mediated communications. I also examined how Black women sex workers develop their own Black sexual politics in relation to these controlling images in order to self-define and self-determine themselves as Black women and sexual beings. And then I built on what Catherine McKittrick calls the demonic grounds to think about the ways that the geography, space, and place are social constructs meant to marginalize Black women's bodies into the margins of population centers, thus making the absence of Black women in a certain space the norm, while their presence marks deviance. And then finally, I built on various internet-based communication theories. So the mobile interface theory by Jason Farman and selfie assemblage by Aaron Hess to think about the ways that Black women engage in a type of virtual embodiment and the ways that we can recognize how cultural beliefs about race, gender, and other social categories shape embodiment as a spatial practice. And that factors into the ways that I use the strip club as a space offline to think about what happens online. And then I drew on the selfie assemblage to think about the ways that these Black women exotic dancers use images of their self to communicate their cultural capital, their identity, their individuality, as well as the relationship between technology and the body. So through the digital ethnography that I did, I took 4 different approaches. And one of these approaches was first engaging in non-participant observation of Instagram itself as a virtual field site. I also collected a lot of these images. I collected about 31,000 images from about 70 different dancers, or I'm sorry, 80 different dancers. And I then did a content analysis of the images and the videos and the text that they produced on Instagram. I then used the ways that they tag themselves on Instagram with their location feature to create a digital map of the strip club locations that they worked at in their local area, as well as across the national context. And then I also got the chance to survey some of these dancers directly and ask them about their experiences, not only within the strip club, but also using digital technology. So one of the key findings that I had from the study, particularly from the GIS analysis, was the ways that the demonic grounds are present in the landscape of contemporary sex work in several ways. So first, I learned that Black women sex workers tend to work in clubs located in predominantly Black low-income areas away from mainstream adult entertainment spaces. And this was a finding that Siobhan Brooks had in her study as well of the strip club industry in New York. Second, I found that the boundaries of the neighborhoods these strip clubs are located in are shaped by Jim Crow era segregation and the Great Migration. And so if I think, for example, about the context of Atlanta, the way that Black neighborhoods were formed in Atlanta was that at the end of the Civil War, former African-American soldiers moved and formed shanty towns on the outskirts of Atlanta and actually never moved from that place. Instead, what happened was the federal government and the state government instituted housing projects that they converted the shanty town, or that the shanty towns were converted into. And then that center is where the contemporary Black Atlanta emerges out of. So if you go to Atlanta and you visit the Atlanta University Center, where historically Black colleges and universities are located, you are pretty much standing on the original Black Atlanta epicenter. And then finally, I found that gentrification threatens the places wherein Black women exotic dancers perform online. And so what that means is, if we think about the ways that the contemporary sexual leisure landscape is being shaped primarily by the tastes of white middle-class men, but it's also being shaped by people who are pushing anti-sex trafficking legislation and who use zoning laws as a means to disrupt and displace Black women exotic dancers in certain spaces. And one of the ways that I illustrate that when I give this talk is I often talk about how if you go on Instagram and you type the name of a strip club location, and you scroll from the first picture posted and upward, what I found at a location in DC was that the women changed from being Black women exotic dancers on a strip club stage to being thin white women in yoga pants in a fitness studio at the very same location. So this is a way that we can think about how the historical landscape the features of the historical landscape are being deployed in this contemporary sense to advance the schemes and agendas of those who are pushing gentrification. But in light of this, I observed that Black women exotic dancers are doing with digital technology kind of flies in the face of policies such as SESTA and FOSTA that seek to criminalize the digital practices of sex workers. So if you think about the ways these policies are implemented, these platforms penalize sex workers for using these platforms for sex work. However, the majority of the people that I studied actually are using this digital technology not just to promote themselves as sex workers, but also to promote themselves as entrepreneurs. So when I did the survey of the dancers that I did, over half of them indicated that they wanted to be entrepreneurs within the next 5 years after leaving their career. And this is a shift from previous studies that found that most exotic dancers or most sex workers actually wanted to go to school. And I think that reflects the ways that people are becoming aware of the overall economic changes and how there's not really a return in your investment in college education. But once again, this is a type of discourse being pushed by people who are anti-trafficking advocates. And if you go and visit so many of these organizations, they promote education as a resolution to what's affecting these women. So for me, I always say that kind of studying these Black women exotic dancers is kind of how we can see the ways that the afterlife of slavery is maintained in our contemporary society in ways that we don't typically think about when we think about sex work or sex trafficking victims. So specifically, I want to always be able to highlight when we think about contemporary anti-trafficking laws, it's kind of a paradox in that historically it was legal to sexually traffic Black women for over a century here in the United States.
Thank you so much, Melissa. In addition to all of the insights into race and trafficking, I just think methodologically, your work offers so much for current students who are struggling with how to do research in the age of COVID, to be able to take digital information, digital platforms, technology, and then have those tell us concrete things about like city planning, urban planning, maps, people's lives is really, really, really illuminating. So thank you so much. Our next speaker, Sarath, was the first person to remind me that just 2 days before the spot shootings in Atlanta, the Biden administration deported a plane of 33 Vietnamese refugees who had lived in the United States their entire lives back to Vietnam. And this is part of a more than 400% increase in the deportation of Southeast Asians during the Trump administration, and has continued on into the current administration. So despite the fact, or in the same breath, that the Biden administration is being heralded for swiftly passing anti-Asian hate crimes legislations, they're also endorsing this kind of systemic hatred. And I think one of the most powerful mantras Sarath reminds us of is that hashtag stop AIPI hate needs to be rooted in an understanding of systemic violence, not just interpersonal, individual violence, but these systems. And it's been such a gift to be able to think about deportation alongside trafficking. And Sarath, just welcome you to share some of your insights.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Lyndsey and Melissa, for sharing your brilliance. Wow, I feel like I'm at Brown again. I'm getting all nervous and thinking I'm not good enough. But here we go, okay? So, yeah, hi, everybody. Let's race to us today. Greetings. Thanks, Elena, for that wonderful intro. Sarath Sarinai Suong here, he, him, his, Southeast Asian Freedom Network. I just want to start off a little bit by talking a bit about myself, because it's also, I'm so connected to the work that I'm doing. I'm queer, I'm Khmer, and I'm a refugee of U.S. imperialism. So during the American War, or what we called here the Vietnam War, my family fled Cambodia after the U.S. left Southeast Asia, after the U.S. military left Southeast Asia. I was born in the largest refugee camp at the Thai border, and so I consider myself still a citizen of war. And I emigrated to Boston when I was about 5 years old, where I learned about community organizing. Growing up as a poor queer refugee kid in Boston in the 80s and 90s, during the war on drugs, during the rise of private prisons, during all that, really helped me understand actually what this country is about. And so, yeah, so I moved to Providence for college and fell in love with the people and the community, and started organizing there with Prism, and here I am at CFN. So I'm glad to be here with you all. So just a quick thing, Southeast Asian Freedom Network was formed in 2001 to create a united front against the crisis of deportation in Cambodian refugee communities. We've evolved into a movement family of Southeast Asian organizations who are fighting for a world without police, without prisons, and without borders. So we're fighting for abolition. And so, you know, I think as I think about tonight, I think about what am I wanting to say. So I just want to sort of explain a little bit about who we are, how we got here, deportation, connect to trafficking. So I'm hoping y'all can follow with me. So when I say Southeast Asians, I mean those folks who were displaced during the 60s and 80s from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam as a result of the U.S. military in those countries. So this includes Cambodians, Lao, Vietnamese, and Hmong folks, as well as hundreds of other ethnic and indigenous and stateless tribes from those countries. And this political identity is important to us because we've been here for over 40 years, and so for the past few decades, we've built this identity to make sense of our position here in the U.S. racial capitalism, and also find our place in the movement against it. We built this identity to name U.S. imperialism as perpetrators of violence against us and the cause of our homeland's destruction, the reason why we are here in the first place as refugees. And we built this identity to create a way forward for us. And so before we came here, Southeast Asians experienced massive upheaval and violence that was shaped by the U.S. military in the region. As a result of the American war in Southeast Asia, which then sort of exacerbated the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia, also which resulted in the mass carpet bombing of Laos. Southeast Asian refugees were forced to flee our homes and seek refuge in other countries in the U.S. And the U.S. gave us a legal pathway here through the Refugee Resettlement Program. After a lot of organizing and advocating, from civil rights leaders and especially Black leaders during that time to actually for the U.S. to accept South Asian refugees. They created the Office of Refugee Program, Office of Refugee Resettlement, to make sure that we were okay here, but it failed, and it failed to deliver on its promise to stabilize us. We brought to the U.S. as part of the largest refugee flow in the U.S. history, which included over 1.4 million refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And the U.S. promised to resettle us and stabilize us, but instead it abandoned us. And we were subject to the same systemic marginalization as many other communities of color, as poor communities in the U.S. We were resettled into under-resourced and over-policed neighborhoods with failing schools, and we also got caught up in the school to prison to deportation pipeline. And we tried our best. We certainly have tried our best to survive. We came together to form chosen family to protect ourselves from individual systemic racism and hate, and then we were called gangs. We were then we were thrown out of schools, pushed into prisons, into detention, and now being deported back to a country where the U.S. destroyed. And this is just only 40 years ago. So that leads to, I want to talk a little bit about the deportation crisis. So, deportations are unjust and violent, and they continue to re-traumatize the Southeast Asian community. They financially destabilize our families, and we're already often struggling to make ends meet. And emotional deportations add further stress to families who are often struggling with mental health challenges such as depression and PTSD. Currently, there are 16,000 Southeast Asians across the country who have orders of removal. And most of our community members have lived here for most, if not all, of our lives. And we're being forced to go back to a country where we don't know, where we fled as refugee babies and children, and still have little to no connection. We, as CSN, we want to see deportation as a trafficking of human beings on a governmental level, on a national level. We believe that transporting of human bodies, of those deemed expendable because of global capitalism, of those displaced by the state through militarism, because we know the U.S. military is one of the biggest sort of spreader of U.S. capitalism in the world. That the detention and the deportation of refugees and immigrants, because not just Southeast Asians, right? It's so many other communities here, and in particular, Black immigrants, Black migrants, and Black refugees. The detention of us makes a lot of money for prisons and for the governments involved. And so in this sense, we want to view the U.S. immigration system as a human trafficking agency that's sanctioned by the state. And so for us, we know that the deportation of Southeast Asian refugees is a result of the entanglement of U.S. unjust immigration and criminal legal system, and that this entanglement of these two systems that we call crimmigration continues to endlessly punish our communities through detention, deportation, in cycles. So what do, right? We know that we must work towards a new immigration system. We know we need to abolish prisons and police, but we know we need a system, an immigration system that has to be dismantled and remade to really center human rights, dignity, and safety. Right now, immigration in our country is only understood through the lens of security, right? Because we're calling it the Department of Homeland Security. And because of this, ICE is a rogue organization that continues to sort of terrorize our communities and our families. So if you all know anything about Southeast Asians, we have a lot of trauma and a lot of history, but we're also fighters, and we fight back. So ever since we landed, we've been organizing, and we've been supporting each other, and Steve has been working to formalize and strengthen a national and transnational movement to end Southeast Asian refugee deportation. And we've developed infrastructure. We're staying connected to our base of folks who've been deported back in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And we are also at the same time working to find alignment and true solidarity with other communities of color through coalitions, through campaigns, and through movement building. We're working to make sure that we show up and show out as accomplices in the larger fight for racial justice and Black liberation. And so we've been here for 40 years, and we've been organizing for just as long. And we're still developing our analysis, but we know where our heart stands. And we have a lot of questions, but we just have a lot of questions as we're still trying to figure this out. What is our stake in the fight for abolition? How can we use our position as South Asian refugees to disentangle the criminal legal system from the immigration system? How do we rebuild a just, humane immigration system that centers people's freedom of movement? And how do we center Black migrants and refugees as we fight for immigrant justice? And so, and what does all this mean for all of us as refugees and immigrants and people on stolen land, right? And so we're working hard to develop our own politics to move our people towards abolition, towards the side of justice. And with a side that is rooted in anti-imperialism and one that is informed by Black radical tradition. And we know that we must do continuously the work of building unity and alignment with each other. We have a vision of mobilizing our folks to the left, to the larger movement to abolish police and prisons, to tear down walls and borders, to give full reparations to Black folks, and to give land back to Native folks of this country. Thank you. I have a lot more to say.
Thank you so much, Sarath. When I teach a large lecture class on trafficking, I think that this point to understand deportation as the kind of state-sanctioned violence that should be considered trafficking is really, really, really like the point that I hope that they bring home with them. And I think the effects of your organizing are always so powerful. I mean, in 2005, you and probably other people on this call were organizing for ethnic studies, and now I am a professor in that department. So thank you for all of that. Our final speaker is still, I have not heard from them. I think they are just fundamentally trapped in this tunnel. I wish them well, but Yves and I organized together through Red Canary Suong in Flushing. And so I'll share a little bit about our work. I won't go past 8 o'clock, which is the time that we had set anyway for Q&A. So again, encouraging everybody to enter your questions into the chat. Red Canary Suong was founded in 2018 after the 2017 death of a migrant Chinese massage worker named Suong, who fell or leapt to her death from a 4th floor window in Flushing, Queens, after police had raided her place of work for the 3rd time. So facing a 3rd arrest, she was facing possible deportation as an undocumented worker. And so we can only imagine that this is one of the reasons, the kinds of like precarity that she was juggling under policing that caused her to die. Since 2018, we've conducted outreach with massage workers in Flushing as part of the CSSJ. We also do the same with workers throughout Rhode Island. And we've really come to understand the different kinds of policing in the name of stopping human trafficking that has really been enacted on their lives. And I want to share a little bit about what this is looking like in Rhode Island, but I'll maybe couch the story in a larger, more exciting narrative that's based out of Manhattan. So last month, Manhattan DA's office announced that they would cease prosecution charges, which marked an incredibly important shift towards the decriminalization of sex work. But a notable feature of the 914 open cases that the DA closed were not just those with charges related to prosecution, but also included the charge of quote unquote unlicensed massage. And this was no doubt due to the heightened national attention cast on Asian massage work following the shootings at the Atlanta spas. The inclusion of unlicensed massage, however, as we thought about it at Red Canary, really came as somewhat of a surprise. We thought that it was a real indictment and admission of how the DA's office had been using massage license laws as a way to racially profile and police Asian migrant workers for decades. So in the past decade, Asian massage work has somehow become synonymous with human trafficking. And this is not accidental, but this has been an active campaign target of anti-trafficking organizations who have arranged entire programs and campaigns around shutting down quote unquote illicit massage businesses. This category in particular was introduced by the mega NGO, the Polaris Project, who actually removed their pages on illicit massage businesses the day after the massage murders in Atlanta, which many saw as a startling admission of their culpability to increasing the daily violence and surveillance on Asian massage work. So Polaris Project's 2019 report on illicit massage businesses includes numerous suggestions to shut down massage parlor trafficking. And this has resulted in hundreds of crackdowns and raids across the country. Here in Rhode Island in 2016, former Governor Gina Raimondo signed into law a municipal ordinance that established a brand new category of body work. And this would require a distinct license from that of a massage therapist. This law allows cities and towns in Rhode Island to regulate the operation of any massage business in their jurisdiction and lays out very, very mundane bureaucratic requirements for licensing, continued education, and renewal. And they appear completely agnostic, but to date, they have only been used to pursue the policing of Asian massage workers. The particular municipal ordinance instigating this law sought to target Asian massage businesses, in particular following what was called Operation Rubdown, which according to sex worker rights organization Coyote Rhode Island has closed over 60 Asian massage businesses due to fears of their association with human trafficking since 2003. Back in December of 2019, in one of the last raids before the COVID-19 pandemic, the Pawtucket Police Department and Department of Homeland Security, so this is a really interesting pairing that is facilitated by trafficking, the pairing of immigration enforcement and the local police. They raided 3 Asian massage businesses in Pawtucket and arrested 19 people. Most of the Asian massage workers arrested were charged with not having a massage therapy license. Only 3 of them were charged with prostitution, and news media really celebrated once again rescuing victims of trafficking. And just last month, the ruling on the case came out and it mandated that the owner of the spas, Grace Kwan, a 57-year-old woman, forfeit $650,000 of cash proceeds and assets. And these proceeds will be divided between the Pawtucket Police Department and the Rhode Island Attorney General's office in an 80-20 split, $650,000, amidst a national conversation of defunding the police. So these consequences, which take money from Asian businesses and redistribute them to police and prosecutorial agencies, do nothing to support Asian massage workers, but they do show how the policing, the racialized policing of poverty is extremely profitable for law enforcement and for anti-trafficking NGOs. And in fact, in the 2019 fiscal year, the Polaris Project, which was mentioned before, and endorsed the illicit massage business work, grossed an annual revenue of over $13.4 million, really facilitated by the far-reaching impacts of their narratives against trafficking. The use of licensure has come to haunt us once again. This past Friday, in the first raid since the pandemic started, Cranston police raided 3 spas in Cranston and arrested 11 Asian women under the pretense of not having a massage license. And once again, Governor McKee is calling this a success in order to stop human trafficking. More often than not, in nearly every case that we've researched, in the case of New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft in Palm Beach, in the case in hundreds of cases in New York, in cases here in Rhode Island, nearly every single person who's interviewed says that they are not a victim of human trafficking. Nobody can find a single case of human trafficking, but particularly in that Kraft case in Florida, several of the workers arrested during the raid were shuttled between detention facilities. Those who were undocumented faced deportation. One had several $1,000s seized from her bank account. And then those who are citizens and who aren't deported are simply just jailed, fined, released, only to find their old workplace shut down, forcing them into the further precarious position of looking for new options for work. Massage work just being one of a limited number of options for migrant low-wage workers in the service and manufacturing sectors. So our work at the center suggests that the consequences of such a raid and rescue approach always fall disproportionately on migrant workers who are vulnerable to their economic status, their immigration status, and their race. And on that note, I will close out the formal panelist portion of our talk today and turn it over to some questions from the audience. Thank you once again to all of our speakers. The first question we have up is for Lyndsey from Kiku. Can Lyndsey give a bit more context about what is actually behind the stories that are used as examples of Africans enslaving themselves? I'm not familiar with this concept.
Thanks so much for the question, Kiku. Yeah, so actually, our colleague Sam Okiere works on this exact issue. So the region that a lot of so-called child slaves, the anti-trafficking organizations find is called Lake Volta in Ghana. And basically it's a subsistence fishing community. So families are supporting themselves by fishing in the Lake Volta, right? And Sam's work also makes the point that the lake is a kind of hub of the community. It's a place for people to learn how to fish, to make a living fishing, to feed themselves, but also to have fun, to sell goods to each other, to engage in community building. But what happens is that this idea that anti-trafficking organizations have really promoted this idea of child labor, child slavery, specifically in Ghana. What it does is it encourages, I mean, these organizations are funded through, they're mostly Western American-based and UK-based NGOs. They get money from the US government, they get money from corporations, they run these programs, and then they descend on Lake Volta. They find kids in boats, in canoes, and actually Sam makes this point in an op-ed, which I think is really helpful. He says that, outsiders seeing kids on boats does not mean that these children are like enslaved in the fishing industry, right? That this is a apprenticeship-based system, that this is a community of people who live, who make their living and who subsist on this lake. And so, on the one hand, you could say that it's a story of poverty, right? These are uneven global conditions. But I also think it's important to understand a little bit about the history of Lake Volta and the history of Ghana in particular. So, in post-independence Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah is fighting to be able to, this is in the late 50s, early 60s, to be able to have Ghana be self-sustaining out from the control of British and American economy. US corporations at that time play a big role in not making that possible. And so you can see that there are these legacies of colonialism that continue to affect the economies of places that now US and UK based anti-trafficking organizations have this alibi in a sense, right? That they're going in and saving these kids whose parents are so poor that they would sell them to enslavers, when that actually bears no resemblance. Ethnographers who work on this on the ground, including Sam, to what's really going on. So it becomes an opportunistic use of trying to make sense of global disparities, essentially.
Thank you so much, Lyndsey. Sam is a dear friend of the center as well. And I've posted a link to his op-ed in the chat. Next question to Melissa. The question is asking if you could elaborate a little bit on more about the policing of technological platforms, including you had mentioned FOSTA and SESTA, how these, the policing of trafficking has had ripple effects into these areas on Instagram that we don't typically, like we're not considering Instagram as negatively as we might consider like Backpage or something like that. So what are the impacts?
So Backpage is what FESTA and SOSTA were, and FOSTA and SESTA were initially targeting. And so FOSTA is the federal law, and then SESTA is more so the state level law. And so the notion of Backpage, and at one point Craigslist ads, was this idea that sex workers were using these pages to facilitate sexual transactions and encounters. But in particular, the narrative set forth by anti-sex trafficking groups was this narrative of the pimp and the ways that these alleged pimps were using these websites to traffic women and young girls. And so it's not to say that these aren't factually true, but it is to say that comparative to the women self-selecting to use these platforms themselves, it wasn't the entire story. And so going back to the arguments made about digital technology actually being something that enhances the livelihood of sex workers, a lot of sex workers were actually able to eliminate the pimp as a middleman in order to use digital technology to facilitate their own transactions and to name their own terms and to create safe encounters for themselves. So what these policies encouraged these platforms to do was they basically changed who would be at fault in the event that sex trafficking actually did occur on these platforms, and it enabled the government to penalize these platforms, internet-based platforms, for the sexual transactions that occurred. But the thing about it is that there are certain sexual commerce that is considered legal in the United States. However, the motivations of sex trafficking groups is always to kind of eliminate it all. So a lot of the discourse that we see in anti-sex trafficking is rooted in the progressive movement and rooted in the anti-brothel movement of the 1920s onward. So in the case of the contemporary implementation of this, what happens is because we have already eliminated or made illegal this idea of facilitating sex work in public spaces, or say what we call street walking, for example, now the penalty goes to the ways that people are using digital technology to kind of eliminate the ways that surveillance was happening historically. So historically, when we think of the streetwalker, we think about the anti-vice squads and the ways that the law enforcement was deployed to surveil particularly low income and people of color neighborhoods for the sex workers in those spaces. Meanwhile, rich elite white women had their own ways of circumventing this, particularly with technology. So historically, if we think about the shift from the streetwalker to the call girl, who would have been able to have access and to afford the digital or the technology at the time, the landline technology at the time, in order to engage in that practice, it historically would have been white women. Even the practice of brothels, for example, who would have historically been enabled, permitted, allowed to own homes on their own, it would have been white women. And on the flip side, the women who were more likely and still to this day are to be trafficked or to be enslaved sexually are women of color and girls of color, particularly because, like I said, historically, we have always allowed this to be the case in the United States. And we can even debate whether or not the Emancipation Proclamation actually eliminated that when it comes to Black women and girls. So with the contemporary iteration of these sex trafficking policies and targeting digital platforms, the narrative that trafficking is going on still, once again, kind of erases the reality of what's actually happening on these digital platforms, and it motivates digital platforms to shift who their audience and consumer is. So given that white male middle class interests are what shape all of sexual commerce in the United States, if you go on Instagram and you were to create a professional profile, you would actually be able to identify yourself as providing adult services or adult entertainment. However, to do this, you would have to be a white woman porn star. You would have to be owner of a strip club or some type of porn production company, you would have to be viewing the things that the United States at this moment in time has legally sanctioned as permissible. The ways that this tends to affect Black women in particular disproportionately is that the mechanisms embedded in the technology, particularly around, say, the feature of reporting somebody, tend to penalize the ways that Black women use their erotic capital. So for example, a lot of Black women exotic dancers, because of the nature of the work that they do in the strip club related to hip hop music, perform twerking. However, if you were to go on Instagram right now and search the hashtag twerking, you would actually see white women fitness type people as the most frequently displayed people. And then there are also times that Instagram actually removes your ability to see twerking as a hashtag under the claim that there's some type of nefarious content going on under that particular hashtag. So that being said, what Instagram in particular has been called out for doing is that I believe either sometime earlier this year or late last year, they tried to change their policy saying, quote, that strip club performances were banned from the app. And so what that does then is the ways that exotic dancers are using Instagram as a marketing tool to gain their own followers. And like I said, typically convert these followers into consumers for their own personal ventures. This platform, motivated by trying to avoid the penalties of FOSTA and SESTA, and creates these new policies that then once again get deployed against Black women dancers in particular, because at least in my own study, white women exotic dancers don't really use Instagram in the same way to the same extent. Neither do white-owned strip clubs. And that's because there's different types of policies around visibility and who gets to control the image in relation to these different type of strip clubs. For example, because the Black woman's exotic dance is so attached to hip hop music, she has to be visible because she's going to be used in a rap music video. She might be used in a flyer. She might be used not even for rap music videos, but also other types of Black leisure practices such as car shows, or even being featured as an actress or on a reality television show. So there's actually so many different ways that Black women exotic dancers do labor. So when Instagram actually penalizes them for strip club performances, which are a very small segment of what they actually do, they take away their right to participate in the platform economy, just like everybody else gets to do. And so I often think about, say, Kim Kardashian can put her booty up and Instagram's not going to take down her account.
Thank you so much for really, really getting to the heart of how the different kinds of policing restrictions in the name of anti-trafficking really, really hone in on policing of particular kinds of racialized sexual labor. We have one final question for Sarath, who is no longer pinned. So, okay, he's coming back. Sarath, I think this question may be from somebody who was in school with you at one point, but could you reflect on 20 years of organizing in Providence, from your days as a student organizer till now? What new opportunities and constraints still exist, and what is new on the horizon?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, so just reflect on 20 years of organizing in Providence. Yeah. I mean, I think my organizing, started before I went to Brown. I was doing sort of gang mediation work, which is essentially was supporting other South Asian youth against police violence in Boston. That's what we got the money for the gang stuff in order to do that. But anyway, so I think when coming to Providence, I worked. I made sure to get off campus as much as possible, and be able to do that in a way that is humble and that is respectful of the movements and the organizations and the communities that have been organizing, right, in Providence since forever. And after I had left Brown, and really sort of, the genesis of the of PRISM, or Providence Youth Student Movement, was really around looking around and seeing that there was actually, at that time, there was no space for young people to actually challenge the state, right? And when we found out that the Providence Police Department was actually created in the 80s to survey and profile Black and brown, and in particular Southeast Asian young people as gang members, right, and to sort of put them into this database that's within the Providence Police Department, we knew then that we actually needed to create a space and a movement in Providence and in Rhode Island to actually push back against that. And in a lot of ways, with as much humility as possible, I want to say that the work that we did with PRISM really, I think, helped to push other youth organizations to think more critically about the root causes of around the campaign and the work that we all were doing. And also, it actually pushed Southeast Asian organizations to take a good hard look at ourselves, right? And sort of to think about how are we using resources that actually just sort of, how are we using the resources that our community, that we're getting, the very little resources that we're getting for our community, and to also sort of create spaces within those direct service organizations to also have our folks think a little bit deeper and think about the root causes of what's happening and why they need these resources. We also, I think, have been able to expand and support other organizations to really think about more critically about the work that we're all doing in Rhode Island. And so I think that movement work and organizing in Rhode Island is really tough. I say that we are the smallest state with the biggest heart, and we have such a beautiful, rich history of organizing, of fighting back, of resisting, that I think, my contribution to it for the past couple of decades has really been helping to, one, think about how do we define violence and how do we define safety in our communities. I think even in the past 2 decades, we've done so much conversations about community safety, just sort of the police propaganda and all the ICE bullshit, really, and then be able to think critically, how do we think about safety, right? And using our position as Southeast Asians, we faced fascism. We faced these sort of detention centers and these camps and these refugee camps, and even while facing them, we looked back and we organized individually and in families, and we survived that. And so for us, it was like, how do we go back into into the power that we have as refugees, as immigrant communities, as poor communities, as communities of color? How do we go back into those strengths? How do we lean on those sort of history that we have? And how do we then sort of build loving spaces, the families, the chosen families, the movement families, the street families, the neighborhood families, do things like neighborhood cop watch, to do things like making sure our folks have access to legal resources when they are profiled and brutalized by the police, to making sure that we have a phone tree so that when someone in the community gets picked up by ICE, everybody in the community knows what's happening, right? So building the sort of smaller infrastructure systems, I think, within the community and within the families and neighborhoods, is for me really about true safety. It's really taking sort of the power that we have in our communities and the connections that we have and the love that we have for each other to defend each other from the state. So I want to believe that we push the envelope a little bit and push that very expanded, Rhode Island to movements to really think a little more about state violence and how to really rethink safety and truly defend each other. But there's a whole other stuff. It's been a hot mess, but it's been a beautiful hot mess.
Thank you so much, and thanks for continuing to share with us, for current students, how to do that work of community engagement humbly, as you say. That brings us to a close. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists and to our audience for your engagement and your attendance this evening. I am going to turn it back over to Eldridge Gilbert, class of 2005 and current president of IPC. Take us home, Al.
Thank you so much for handing it back to me so gracefully. To all of our panelists, to you, Elena, thank you for sharing your wisdom, all that you have shared with us. I know my head is reeling and spinning. Sarath, thank you so much for participating tonight. I told Professor Shih, I was like, Sarath was my TWTPC, and so your foothold at Brown and the way in which you led TWTP is just an example of the way that Brown seeks to be or forerunner in that work, from a student's very first, step on campus through the alumni experiences is what we hope to have created and continue today, and that would not have been possible without all of our panelists. So thank you so very much. Yen started out by saying how CSSJ, the center, is one of a kind in the American Academy. And I think we have we heard so many evidence of that tonight. I can't imagine any other entity at Brown that, other than the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, that gives us multiple insights to the implications of racial slavery today, and then what happens as recently as Friday with Professor Shih, what you shared, which is just mind-blowing in the multitude of ways that we continue to control and subvert the freedom of Black and Asian women, whether it is economically. And Melissa Brown, thank you so much for the ways in which you tease that out. And the ways in which we can be easily misled as consumers of social justice work. Lyndsey, for the way that you kind of tease that out. And we have so much responsibility to be thoughtful about what we take in, to question the images that are posed to us, and to investigate the way that may be reflections of anti-Blackness, racism, and sexism, and the intersection of the two constantly coming our way. And to remember that the fight for an oppression-free life is not just one for our Black communities and for our Native communities, of which there are many, but also to be thoughtful about the ways that our Asian immigrant communities are also in that fight as well. And so the idea of solidarity is just coming up so clearly for me. And so I look forward to partnering with A4 in the future and CSJ in the future while we investigate other ways in which we can be in solidarity with one another and learn from one another about the ways to make this country better. But thank you all so much. I just want to close and remind us of how, no other institutions give us this opportunity, and other institutions look to CSSJ, look to Brown because of CSSJ for inspiration for the work that you do, the very rigorous academic work, the thought leadership, and the collaborative approach to research, teaching, and public engagement that is expansive from the humanities and the arts, the sciences, and without support, contributions to the endowment of CSSJ, this work can't continue, and it is vital that it continues not only as members of the Brown community, but members of the world. Yen just dropped the link for anyone who would like to give in this moment towards the endowment of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And we hope that you attendees will be willing to join us as we commit to giving the center funds to help fuel its growth and deepen its impact in the community and the outreach that it does moving forward. So thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you, Yen, for your partnership, Professor Bogues, Professor Shih, for your leadership and the work that you do every day at CSSJ, to all of them, the staff at CSSJ who, again, come together to help make this event possible. Have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you all again in future events.